Welcome to TC Talks, a podcast brought to you by the Teaching Commons at York University. We will begin this podcast with an acknowledgement of the land on which we are situated. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region.
Happy 2020, York colleagues, and welcome back to a brand new edition of TC Talks. Today, we are talking about assumptions that we make about the learners in our classrooms. My name is Mandy Frake-Mistak, and I'm an educational developer at the Teaching Commons. I'm joined today with Lisa Nendersby and Natasha May, who are both also educational developers at the Teaching Commons, but we also have a fair bit of teaching history before our educational development work. Lisa, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your teaching outside of educational development?
Sure, thanks, Mandy. So a lot of my previous teaching experience is in the realm of, student affairs and services. So I've done a lot of work around student development theory, thinking about student development across the spectrum, but also perhaps more recently around leadership development and leadership development theory. So what do we mean by leader and leadership, and how do we develop those skills in others?
Natasha, you do a lot of teaching. Tell us about it.
Thank you, Mandy. I currently teach in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics as a contract faculty member, in addition to my educational developer work. And so I teach whatever courses that I get to teach. Primarily, though, my background is in pure mathematics, and so I often teach a course called Problems, Conjectures, and Proofs, which focuses on, the main element of pure mathematics, which is proof, and thinking about how to communicate mathematics to each other.
And once upon a time, I was contract faculty teaching in faculties of education across the province. And these courses ranged anywhere from health and physical education. In my applied health sciences background, that covered all kinds of aspects of health, including reflections on health and healthy living. And then since there, I've taught some higher education policy courses, all of which we've been discussing, and I think in terms of our teaching experience have collectively led us to our work now within the Teaching Commons as developers, but also in the support work that we do with faculties and faculty members. We hear a lot of the challenges that they face, particularly around this time of year when we're coming back. We're now midterm, in that we've just launched a brand new winter term. So students are not as fresh as they were in September. Perhaps they are just as much anxious and perhaps even more burnt out than they were, given there are things still happening. Natasha, you were even just saying you've got students writing deferred exams coming up this week. Sure. So there's a lot of things happening. So maybe let's just get into this in terms of the assumptions that we make as instructors in higher education. And in fact, what assumptions do we make about our students at the beginning of term?
Natasha and I are looking at each other trying to figure out where to start. I would say for me, one big assumption that I make, and maybe it's not unique to end of term, and I should preface that with did make, of course I don't make that anymore, but I suppose I trained myself out of it, is how much time students have or don't have to do the work that we've assigned to them in class. So Mandy brought up a really good point about the lives that they have outside of the classroom, and in particular in the winter term when they're feeling more burnt out or feeling like they're coming back to something as opposed to starting something, and maybe their expectations are different or their energy level is different. So I may come in really excited about my course and give them lots of opportunities to engage, but they may not want or need that or be able to engage in the same way. So I make assumptions about time, I make assumptions about energy, and sometimes I have to remind myself that there are other things going on that may impact what I think is an ideal way to engage with me in the classroom.
I love that you said energy. I don't know if you felt it all the same way. When we came back from the break, came back to the office, I was so happy to see everybody and I did feel energized, but it didn't take long before I felt completely overwhelmed. And I know this isn't unique to our office. It's not unique to anybody, but how that too sort of shapes the assumptions that perhaps we're rightly and or wrongly making about our students and our ability to teach them, given that we're tired and feeling burnt out too.
Yeah, so I won't echo those sentiments, although I completely agree. I want to think about prerequisites as sort of a given assumption that we should be able to make, right? These are requirements for the students in this course, right? And those are advertised to students. Different things to think about when we make those assumptions is just because that's a requirement doesn't mean that our students actually have those prerequisites necessarily. And also thinking about what does it really mean that they have those prerequisites, because to pass a course means that, to be successful and have passed that course means that they got maybe 50%. Maybe they got 100%, and then they truly have all those prerequisite skills, but maybe they only got 50% of that required skill. And also, if you're not in complete contact with those colleagues of those prerequisites for whatever reason, maybe it's completely outside of your own department, you don't even know who's teaching those, it may be difficult to really understand what is actually covered in those courses that are prerequisites. So I think that's an assumption that is easy to make and difficult to respond to.
You also make me think of retention levels. So it's one thing to have completed the prerequisites, but then to retain the information or even to have had met or achieved the learning outcomes for those particular courses to be able to use them efficiently. And I hesitate, I'm not sure if that's the right word to use in this instance, but to bring them into those skills into the new class, and they don't remember what they did. Maybe it was last year, or maybe they didn't perform very well for a variety of different reasons. And I think that, I don't know if that's necessarily an assumption, because we don't have that. We don't have any evidence as to what they remember and what they don't. I think we find out quickly often, or when we don't find out quickly, we find out the hard way, and it's way too late to help to remediate, I think, that situation sometimes.
And just to say, when you said retention, I also took that as students year to year in the program. And so the composition of your class is maybe not every student who came from that first year class into a second year class, or students who are coming in and out for transfer credits or whatever reason. And they may not have all taken the same path to get to your class. And so another way that we're assuming they've all sort of had the same experience, but maybe it's really different.
Yeah, no, fully agreed. And so I guess that begs the question then, how do these assumptions that we're making, maybe if we're not even realizing them in the moment, and they come as hindsight to us, but so how do these assumptions affect our teaching?
I think you said something really important, which is that sometimes it makes it quite challenging, right? And sometimes we don't even know until it's later, right? Like we make assumptions, we teach and act with these assumptions, and then we finally check in with the students because they had an assignment and we take that in, and then they didn't do as well as we thought, and then we try and figure out, well, why that was, and then that makes it difficult to continue. What do you do when, well, they needed to do well on that assignment to now get the next stuff, so now I have to take a step back and cover that material again, right? Like maybe I wasted a few weeks because I didn't properly know the prerequisite material, and so if I had started where they were, it seems like that would take a lot of time. I can't reteach them all of this stuff that they need to know, but I maybe have wasted 3 weeks that now I have to go back and teach all the stuff again that I taught before, or figure out ways to give them resources to catch up, and then that creates a lag or difficulty in trying to get students to participate and be excited about the class and all of those things.
And there's something about the types of assignments we give to, or how we get them to demonstrate that knowledge. I remember making assumptions about, of course they all know how to write an essay, or of course they all know what I'm looking for when I ask them to do an oral presentation. And they often don't. And even if we create rubrics and have descriptions, they may not know what some of this vocabulary means, first generation, students or otherwise, but they may not also have come equipped with those types of skills or have never had practice with this before. And so I'm assuming, here you go, here's a group presentation, go ahead, do the group presentation. And I may not have been that dismissive or may not have been that general, but I still made assumptions that they know enough to be able to do this. Or I've given them, like you said, Natasha, enough resources to be able to do this. And then they often don't tell me that they don't feel like they have those resources, maybe because they don't even know they don't know. And then I'm stuck with the same issue of I'm trying to scaffold towards something bigger, but now I have to go backward instead of forward.
Your comment about rubrics and various things made me think that sometimes, like in mathematics, for example, we don't use rubrics often. Although within this mathematics communication type course I was talking about, there is this extra element of skill that we're trying to teach them. So we're very used to in mathematics teaching, specific content and problems and concepts and testing that. But when we think about skills, then there is this opportunity for rubrics. But at the same time, it becomes difficult because in mathematics there's often a right answer. So it's hard to write a rubric in which we can actually say specifically what we're looking for without giving the answer away. And so it makes it tricky for the students, particularly, so if I'm talking very specifically about this course and this skill, it's the first time that they have really thought about communicating mathematics. And so it's actually really difficult for them. And so even if I have a rubric and give them that kind of guidance, essentially we're taking the whole course to try and build up to being able to do this. And so it makes it difficult. So I think about a different course I taught in topics in mathematics education, where they're interested in being math teachers, not all of them, but that's sort of, there's an opportunity there to have them engage with a rubric. So I get them to try it out, self-assess, peer assess, both. So they self-assess the assignment before they bring it into the class. Then in the classroom, they peer assess, so they get to read someone else's and apply the rubric. And then we have a conversation about the rubric. So how easy was it? When you applied it, does it make sense? When you reviewed someone else's work, did you have questions? How easy was it to apply? Do you understand it? Are there gaps? If you have the opportunity to use rubrics in that way so that they can use them and know how to use them. I think I don't know how I got there from what you said, Lisa, but
we just work so well together, Natasha.
But I thought that was useful to think about.
Mm-hmm.
So all along I've been thinking about so when you've made assumptions and incorrect assumptions or perhaps inappropriate assumptions about your group of learners and the time in which you teach and the physical environment in which you teach. So the question about what effects are there, do you feel, on your teaching? I remember very concretely there being such a disconnect between my and the students' time together. So after a while, you develop some kind of a rapport with the student body, and it's large group dynamic. Large group being anything from 20 or 15 students, or 100, 250, 300, and 500 for some of our colleagues here at York. There's still something that we feel and something that we start to get a little bit more accustomed to in terms of our interactions with them given our class time. And if our assumptions are wrong, I should say when I've made wrong assumptions, I could feel that in the moment. That dynamic that I had become accustomed to was definitely affected, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And I remember asking them in the moment, something else is going on here. What's going on here? And sometimes they're really good, and then they just explode. Oh, we've got so many things going on, and this week is really overwhelming compared to other weeks. Or, we're just ticked off because this game is on TV and we're having to be here and listen to you. Like, yeah, you made a choice. We make choices. But I just remember in the moment there being something almost tangible that I could sense that something was just not quite right. And so when I think about, when we reflect in action, as things are happening in our teaching, and you can just feel it, and that something is not quite right because you have that experience. How we respond to those experiences, I think, vary. So maybe let's talk about that a little bit. Sort of maybe what strategies you have used to challenge the assumptions you've made about teaching. And again, not perhaps just limited to this time of year, but how do we then kind of remediate the assumptions we've made once we've realized that we're wrong?
I'm going to start because I have a sort of proactive approach.
Awesome.
Because the first time I ever taught a course, not as a teaching assistant, but as the course director. I was teaching a course I didn't know anything about, meaning that I didn't know where it fit and who the students were, like what this course was required for. And it happened to be in the second term of the summer term, so the S2 term. And so I knew enough in advance to be able to connect with the students. So I used the opportunity to send out a short email and ask them a few questions so I could get a sense of who my students were. Not generally, where does this course fit? As important as that is, you can make a lot of assumptions about that kind of information. So because it was a small class, I think 20 students or something, it was very easy for me to do this. It may not be at all even possible for 500 students. And I think some people have used iClicker and various things in that first class to get some information. But in this case, I simply just asked them, where are you coming from? Why are you taking this class? What is your major? Why do you, is this class required? Why is it required? And those kinds of things. And so that helped me because I just felt completely lost. Like, I have no idea where to start. I don't know. So I didn't want to make assumptions, essentially. So I took that approach. I haven't ever done that again for a variety of reasons, I'm sure. Maybe I had enough information to actually make more assumptions, which is probably a bad thing. So it's make me think about, going back to that original practice where I was a bit uncomfortable and trying to keep that uncomfortableness to try and avoid making some assumptions. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because it's so simple yet so complex. And we've had these conversations with faculty, and I've had these conversations with myself. Like, I wonder about what the students are thinking, or what do I know about? Maybe I should ask the students that. Like, I've always joked, but I'm serious when I say, I hate the term "the students" because there are so many assumptions just in that term. So to do something like you were saying, Natasha, like to just ask in one form or another, or what information is going to be helpful. And I would extend that by putting in a plug for formative assessment, which really has changed how I've made assumptions or made more informed assumptions. Asking throughout the course, how are things going? Like you were saying, Mandy, like what's going on here? Because you know your students well enough and you know yourself well enough that you can ask those questions. And whether that's, reflection in action, as Mandy so aptly put it, or some sort of, 1 minute paper or iClicker or, interactive polling or something that allows you to check in. And what I like about that too is that it strengthens the rapport you have with your students. So hopefully this becomes more cyclical. So yes, you are asking and you should be proactive in asking, but maybe your students will actively or proactively challenge your assumptions too, because they feel listened to and they feel like you've created an environment where they can challenge you in a respectful, meaningful, appropriate way. So it creates an environment where this is ideally more likely to happen.
I think that we've raised a lot of really good points in the last little bit that we've been chit-chatting about this. I wonder what the broader community at York would have to say about perhaps assumptions that they've made in their teaching. When did they come to realize that they made assumptions? And it could be like right ones or wrong ones. And then what did that mean? How did that affect your teaching on a long-term basis? As from my story, and then what Lisa was just saying, I learned to continue to talk to my students that in fact is a good thing. I mean, they're mine while they're in my classroom, even that is probably unfair to say, but I get them. I get to be with them for that time, and that means that I get to talk to them, and they can choose to talk to me if they wish. But anyways.
I think the one thing I want to say was the difference between... So formative assessment, you can think of it in two different ways. And I think sometimes you can get both answers with the same activity. So when you said formative assessment, I thought about, okay, so we talked about this concept. Can you tell me what you remember about it? This is something that I assume that you know. Tell me what you know about it, right? Sort of in this pre-assessment kind of way. But then what I also heard Lisa say, and Mandy too, was some evaluation of the teaching. So how am I responding to your needs? What's going on? What can I do better? What should I continue doing? What should I stop doing? And so I think there are different strategies to get at both kinds of, to keep the conversation in both ways going. And sometimes I think of these actually completely different, but sometimes you can accomplish it with the same activity. Although maybe sometimes we make assumptions based on some of the info, right? Like
Yes.
one of these formative assessment opportunities, write a 1-minute paper telling me what you learned in class today, what surprised you the most, what's still unclear. And then we make assumptions about, oh shoot, what did I do that made that happen? Where maybe it didn't have anything to do with you and
Right.
had something to do with something else. So we
Yeah.
might need to be a bit more specific when we want actual feedback on our own teaching, because otherwise you make assumptions. I think it's somewhat dangerous for yourself as well to make assumptions, right? Course evaluations, you never want to read them, and you always focus on the negative ones, and maybe we're making all kinds of assumptions because we don't have the full picture. So being as transparent as possible, trying to write good questions might be something tricky.
No, I was just going to say, and being intentional in our strategies too, because I make an assumption sometimes that a 1-minute paper is one of the best ways of formative assessment, and it's not always, because it may be more of the how things are going than demonstrating knowledge, depending on what that knowledge is and your learning outcomes. The only other thing I was going to add was just for this, it reminds me about being comfortable, being flexible. And that was my big lesson. Like if I'm challenging my assumptions and asking questions, I can't keep doing things in the structured way that I thought I was going to, which is still challenging for me, but challenging my assumptions anyways helped me be better at that.
So, York, what do you have to say to all of this? What assumptions do you make about teaching your students at the beginning of term? And then how have these assumptions affected your teaching, either in the short term or over the long term? And what have you learned from them? In the meantime, we're going to conclude our podcast for today. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Natasha. And Happy New Year, York.
Thanks, Mandy.
Thanks for listening to this episode. To learn more about the Teaching Commons or to access a summary of our podcast, please visit teachingcommons.yorku.ca. Join us, Brian, Lisa, and Mandy, next time in the Big Red Chair on TC Talks.
Assumptions based on some of the info, right? Like one of these formative assessment opportunities, write a 1-minute paper telling me what you learned in class today, what surprised you the most, what's still unclear. And then we make assumptions about, oh shoot, what did I do that made that happen? Where maybe it didn't have anything to do with you and had something to do with something else. So we might need to be a bit more specific when we want actual feedback on our own teaching, because otherwise you make assumptions. I think it's somewhat dangerous for yourself as well to make assumptions, right? Course evaluations, you never want to read them, and you always focus on the negative ones, and maybe we're making all kinds of assumptions because we don't have the full picture. So being as transparent as possible, trying to write good questions might be something tricky.
No, I was just going to say, and being intentional in our strategies too, because I make an assumption sometimes that a 1-minute paper is one of the best ways of formative assessment, and it's not always, because it may be more of the how things are going than demonstrating knowledge, depending on what that knowledge is and your learning outcomes. The only other thing I was going to add was just for this, it reminds me about being comfortable, being flexible. And that was my big lesson. Like if I'm challenging my assumptions and asking questions, I can't keep doing things in the structured way that I thought I was going to, which is still challenging for me, but challenging my assumptions anyways helped me be better at that.
So, York, what do you have to say to all of this? What assumptions do you make about teaching your students at the beginning of term? And then how have these assumptions affected your teaching, either in the short term or over the long term? And what have you learned from them? In the meantime, we're going to conclude our podcast for today. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Natasha. And Happy New Year, York.
Thanks, Mandy.
Thanks for listening to this episode. To learn more about the Teaching Commons or to access a summary of our podcast, please visit teachingcommons.yorku.ca. Join us, Brian, Lisa, and Mandy, next time in the Big Red Chair on TC Talks. Visit teachingcommons.yorku.ca. Join us, Brian, Lisa, and Mandy, next time in the Big Red Chair on TC Talks.